Hello and welcome everyone to First Draft Friday, episode 71A. We will have a second 71 episode next week. I am your host, Alessandra Torre with Authors AI, and today I am joined by Wall Street Journal bestselling author Jeff Wheeler. We're going to be talking all about making changes and pivoting in your author career and how that can be important and both powerful, both creatively and professionally. So, welcome, Jeff. It's really great to have you back on First Draft Friday. Do you want to just give the audience just a quick introduction to you and your work?
Sure. It's awesome to be back. Good to see you again, Alessandra. We finally got to meet in person at Inkers Con. I'll do a plug for you there because that was such a great writing conference. Enjoying being there. So I've got over 30 epic fantasy novels. I've sold over 5 million books. I was able to leave my day job at Intel 10 years ago this year.
Wow,
So
congrats.
2014. I can't, it kind of blows my mind how fast it's gone, but all these books later and all the fun later, it's just great to be here with you again.
It's so great to have you. And can we talk a minute about when you left your job? Because how many books did you have published at that point?
I had self-published a couple of them, and then I had signed a 6-book deal with Amazon Publishing.
Wow.
And before I had finished delivering the final book with them is when I made the decision to jump and do it full time, because I was doing about 1 book a year. And I told Amazon, like, look, I could write 3 books a year if I did this full time. So how can we make this work? So 2014, I signed a 3-book deal for my Covenant of Muirwood trilogy, and with the commitment that I'd write all 3 books in 1 year. A little bit stressful and scary to say, hey, I'm leaving the security of, say, a healthcare plan,
Yes.
retirement plan, all that
401k.
stuff. But I'd had several books with them. I'd seen the success come, and I said, you know what? I want to do this full time. That had been my goal for years, like most of my life. I wanted to be a full time author. So, been 10 years doing it. So
It's interesting because a lot of authors are like, oh, if I could write full time, then whatever current production I could triple or whatever. Did you find that that was actually the case, that more hours, more free hours translated into more books written? Or did you kind of struggle? Because I know when I was almost more productive when I had a second job, because then I really like focused on my time. But when suddenly I had the whole day, it was like, oh, like, I don't know. I just found all this other stuff to do. So I'm curious if that was an easy transition for you to make.
having been at Intel for my career, I had learned to be very productive and efficient with my time, and I had done enough. I knew myself well enough that it's like, hey, I'm going to write first thing in the day. I'm going to make sure I have my email and social media off, cell
Yeah.
phone stuffed in a
Like, this is
drawer.
my real working hours.
This is my real working hour, and I'm going to write until I finish that chapter for that day.
Mhm.
Because I guess having the time pressure of a commitment,
Yeah.
right? I've got
Makes
a
me
publishing contract. I have these deadlines. I got to deliver the first book in 3 months. I got to deliver the second book after that. That helped motivate me. So as long as I could finish that chapter for the day, then I could be more distracted by other things. But just having that hanging over my head, I am not a procrastinator by nature.
Yeah.
And so it drives some of my kids nuts because I have many members of my family who are procrastinators, and we drive each other nuts. But I have to have that commitment. I have to have that done. And it's made it a lot easier to be able to do it. But that Intel is still part of my soul, unfortunately. But
It's not a bad thing. I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that really helps. And like you said, it does make a difference when you do have, like, when you're contractually obligated. Because I was attending a class, like, it was on like mental, like, processes of writers. And it was like there are some writers, and I realize that I am that writer, that have to have a deadline. If I don't have a deadline, it'll be a year, it'll be 18 months before I write a book. But if I don't have a deadline either set by like a pre-order I set up on Amazon, or typically it's an editor or publisher that's waiting on me, and I know, like, if I'm late, then they have to shift. It is extremely inconvenient and costly for them So I really have to meet those deadlines. That's the only way. Like now I know I work best in crunch time, and I work best with that threat over me. And that was impressive that you did 3 books, published or committed books. Yeah, in a year. How long is a typical book for you?
About 90,000
Okay.
words ish. So, sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less, but I know that I kind of, when I start a book, I know I can finish it in about 3 months, the
Mhm.
first draft.
Yeah.
And so I kind of have to bank on that. So with that, I can publish 3 to 4 books a year, and Amazon can only handle 3. So I do usually an indie or something separate, another way. So I do 3 to 4 books a year and have been almost the whole time. So
And do you edit as you like, because you'll submit a book to Amazon and then it's 2 or 3 weeks and then you get your editorial feedback. So are you writing another book then? Are you taking time off?
no,
Or
I
are you
start
editing it?
when I finish it, I write it start to finish, and then I reread it myself. And then while that's being turned in, I start the next book in the
Okay.
series. So unless, the only time I take off, so to speak, is when I'm in between series, because I need time to kind of organize my thoughts, and I kind of have a world building process that I go through before I start a new series. Because once I'm in the middle of it, then it's kind of like I'm in creation mode. But I'll spend sometimes a month in between series, to kind of plot out or figure out the world building and what I want to get done with it.
And returning to our topic today, which is really about kind of pivoting. So fantasy has a lot of world building, obviously. I mean, there is a lot of you're creating oftentimes like entirely new civilizations and cultures and, and histories. And you wrote in fantasy, it is strictly fantasy. It's not science fiction in
Correct.
fantasy for 8 years, however long since you've quit your job. And then you moved recently. And actually, I'm going to cliffhanger that question just a second because we do have a timely question from the audience, and that's from YouTube. So, hi, Daryl. It's great to have you here. Daryl had a question for you, Jeff, and that's, do you regret signing a multi-book deal? Sometimes authors wish they hadn't locked in that long. And this is a really good question for your first book deal, which was a 6-book deal. Did that scare you at first? And was there any point in time where you were like, oh, like maybe this is too big of a commitment?
I certainly do not regret signing the deal. And what made mine a little bit different is I sold Amazon 3 books I had already written, and then they repackaged it, made audiobooks, redid the covers, made them a lot better than what I did. And then the other 3 books I hadn't written yet. I was already writing the first one, but I hadn't finished it yet. So they wanted what had been successful as well as what I was working on. And so that was kind of my strategy with that. So I don't regret it. And then I've continued to work with them and sign new publishing deals with them, as well as with other editors too. I kind of keep my field open, but I've been treated very great by Amazon Publishing. So I've stayed with them for like 12 years now.
And I have to just give a disclaimer, Daryl. Jeff and I are both with Amazon Publishing. So we were both self published. We are both still self publishing. But Jeff is with, what is
47 North.
47 North, which is their fantasy imprint, though they do venture out a little bit, which we'll talk about in a minute. And I'm with Thomas and Mercer, which is their suspense, mystery, thriller, suspense imprint. And I've signed multiple book deals with other publishers, and I have regretted some of those. But Amazon is, in all sincerity, like, this isn't us thinking that someone's going to watch this. They're such a fantastic publisher to work with. And they are very different than a lot of other publishers in terms of their flexibility and interaction with us as authors. So it's, I think it helped, Jeff, that you did have that 3-book history with them, even though it was already published, to kind of get a sense of what that working relationship would be.
Exactly.
So you were a highly successful fantasy author, and then recently you made a fairly major change in your writing and audience. So can you talk to us about that and how that came to be, and the process?
Absolutely. So, in the last year in 2023, I published with Amazon the beginning of a thriller series called the Dresden Codex. And I'm also very grateful, Alessandra, you gave me a book blurb for it, which was so appreciated, because especially when you're trying something new, right? You've got all the people that are used to your style of writing. It's like, why would I want to blurb a thriller novel? So I appreciate that. And I think, like with most authors, we write what we're passionate about. And I had this really weird, twisted nightmare. Many of my story ideas sometimes come from my dreams. And I'm like, yeah, but I can't write this as a book because it's not a fantasy. And it didn't make sense to adopt it into a fantasy setting, because part of the peril was it being in our world and in modern days. And so I kind of put it aside, but then I kept thinking about it. And I made the choice. Well, let me talk to Amazon, see how they would feel about pivoting. So when you pivot to something else, it's smart, and I discussed this strategically with them too, to pivot to something adjacent to what you're doing. So within fantasy, a pivot might be science fiction, but as I thought about it, and as my editor told me, she's like, Jeff, your fantasy books have a lot of thriller element to it. So you're pivoting to a different genre, but it's also in your wheelhouse of writing very intense, tension-driven fantasy. So they thought it made a lot of sense to do that. But I found tackling that challenge. They liked the story idea. They liked the pitch. They said, let's do it. But what was weird for me is in my fantasy novels, I always kind of knew, 2 to 3 books out. Like I knew the whole series. I knew where the story was going to go. But with this, I only had the first book, and I signed a 3-book deal with them. And they're like, and we had the mutual agreement that if it's all it went was book 1, that we'd just stop there. But they said, no, we think you can take this on like you have done before. But it was terrifying for me to not know where book 2 is going to be as I'm writing book 1, and not to know until the end of book 1, like the actual writing of it, I started to finally see, oh, book 2 is gonna go there. And so I said, okay, well, I'll do book 2 next. But I wondered maybe I'd have to throw in a couple fantasy books to fill in as I waited for the inspiration to come. But that inspiration came always by the maybe 3/4 mark of the book. Here's where the next people do. So I've always been kind of a plotter more than a pantser. So writing as a pantser was definitely a challenge for me. But that's kind of how it came together. I was able to write all 3 books continuously, like I do for my fantasy series, which means there isn't a huge gap in between the publishing dates. You don't have to wait a year. You only have to wait a couple of months before the next one comes out. And so book 2 came out in December of that series, and book 3 is already written and is slated to come out, I think, in May of this year. So my fans, again, never have to wait very long for the book to come out. But it was definitely, it stretched me in ways that surprised me.
Sorry, were you under the same time frame, like 3 months? Like,
Yes.
okay, so even though you were kind of going into uncharted territory, you still did have kind of back-to-back.
That was the goal. I built into the deadline longer than 3 months. I think I built in 5, but as I started writing it, I found writing thrillers to be just as fast, if not faster, than fantasy. Because really, it's like, okay, what else can I do to mess with their lives? But I kind of pictured it like a movie, like the next scene, and what terrible thing can happen to this family on vacation, getting caught in a global, conspiracy, to destroy the world. So, there's all these new ideas.
Yeah, can you? I see our team just posted the links to Doomsday Match. But can you you don't have a copy of the book handy, do you? You can show them the cover.
I can grab it real quick.
All right. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I literally,
nice
when
to have
started,
a
I was like, oh, it's on my shelf. But there we go. Yeah, so they can see here, it does have a little bit, it almost looks like a little bit of fantasy elements, but can
Yeah.
you give like elevator pitch of the story so that they understand?
Sure, and it was inspired by a vacation I took actually to Florida,
Mhm.
in the hot muggy Florida Everglades. Um, the story, the thing is, imagine a family, the family of a best-selling author, right? I had to
Where'd
tap
that
into,
inspiration come from?
yeah, but they go on this kind of exclusive vacation down to the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. It's famous for the Mayan Riviera, all these temples and pyramids and things that and Mayan lore. And they find out that it's not a relaxing Christmas getaway, that their family is being it has to compete with another family of like a fight to the death, basically, in the old Mayan ball game. And so they're trying to, they're kind of being
Right.
lured down under false pretenses, and then they have to try to find a way to escape. So that wasn't the essence of the dream, but the dream I had was my family was on vacation and we were being hunted by other families we knew. And it's just terrifying. And I woke up like, oh my gosh, I really have nice neighbors. But this is just an author's brain. We're always kind of thinking of the worst case scenario. And my family had moved recently. And so you imagine it's like, it's not all great, in this place where you live. Maybe it's, just your mind, plays tricks on you. So that was the seed of the idea. So, and again, I had no idea where book 2 or book 3 was going to go, but I actually went with my family down to the Yucatan
I was going to ask, yeah,
as part
as
of
research.
research. I've been down there twice and climbed these pyramids and learned about Mayan history, Cortez and the Spanish, and how the impact they had on the people there. And it just, visiting in person, I can't visit any of my fantasy worlds, right? They're all in my imagination. But a lot of, in fact, most of the places that are in this trilogy, I visited, including where the author lives, Bozeman, Montana. That's not where I live, but I took a trip there to go scope it out and see what it was like. And a lot of the little details, like chase scenes in cars, are places that I've actually been to. So very different. A fantasy author normally just has to imagine these things, but that was also a challenge to me too, because there was a much higher level of realism, right?
Accuracy that you have to,
I
right.
had to learn about the FBI and about how government agencies work and things like that. I had to leverage friends in law enforcement and other things like, okay, how would the police react to this kind of a situation? And so, there was definitely more constraints than what I'm used to as a fantasy author, where if I don't know what it is, I can
You just make it
invent
up.
it.
Yeah.
I just make it up.
Yeah.
And as long as it stays logically coherent within the world, the readers aren't going to care. But I've had people complain about, like, the speed of the airplanes they're flying in. They're like, a jet doesn't land at this speed. I'm just like, well, I know. I don't know how fast they land. That wasn't really the point. But it's funny that people are more nitpicky when they have experience in an area and you're showing that you don't know what you're talking about.
100%. So 2 questions. Well, I have a lot of questions, but the first is, this book does have a little bit of supernatural elements. I mean, I don't know if supernatural is the right word, but was that intentionally added to connect with your fantasy audience, or that was just the direction the story took when you were
That's a
creating it?
wonderful question. And I thought about that. But as I immersed myself in the Mayan history,
Mhm.
all of the magic in this book is magic from our
From that.
world,
Yeah.
right? So the more I researched, the more I learned about it, the shape shifting or the kinds of different magic that existed. To me, I'm like, yeah, if you read our own world's history, it can kind of feel like a fantasy novel. So I think it didn't hurt to leverage that. And as I read other thrillers, there's often sometimes a supernatural element in them
Yeah.
too. It might be alien technology, or it might be some sort of
Psychic. Yeah.
Yeah. So I thought, it's not going to hurt, but it's definitely, it's definitely a thriller. It's not an urban
100%.
fantasy. Yeah.
Yeah, and I, as a reader, I'm a thriller reader. I don't read any fantasy. The only fantasy I've read in the last year was for a book club, which was one of your books, which is why when you approached me, I'm like, oh yeah, I know I like Jeff's writing. And I read
Oh,
fantasy for Jeff, so I know that I'll like, a thriller, but it is 100% a thriller. And I love the action in that. So shifting to thrillers, what did you find in terms of craft and in terms of changing? Like, did you have to read thrillers? Was it a world you were already familiar with as a reader? Did you have any concerns with the storytelling aspect of a thriller versus fantasy?
Um, I did, and I wanted to make sure that I was doing it justice, and it was definitely a little nerve wracking. And it reminded me of a quote. The head of Pixar, Ed Catmull, said that if you aren't experiencing failure, then you're making a far worse mistake. You're being driven by the desire to avoid it.
Oh,
And
wow.
I felt like where I had been in my career at that point, all these fantasy novels, I'd shown what I could do, but I wanted to test myself. I had had some series hadn't done as well as others, so I had experienced some degree of failure, but I didn't want to be so afraid of trying something new that I wouldn't stretch myself. So to overcome that fear, I really dove into different thrillers. I asked, my publisher, I asked folks at Thomas and Mercer, like who are some of the top names that I can read, and people like Blake Crouch or Dan Brown. I already liked Dan Brown's work, but I got kind of a list of kind of the who's who of thrillers, and as I read it with the eye of kind of understanding the tropes, like the
Yeah.
points of view, the pacing, and I definitely found pacing to be a much more thing than what I was doing even within my fantasy worlds. I thought my pacing was strong in fantasy, but often these thrillers might take place within 24 to 36 hours, really condensed. I wasn't used to doing books like that. Mine were more maybe weeks or months. And so I looked into those things. And as I was reading it, I looked at, okay, how can I leverage the tropes, but can still keep it Jeff Wheeler, can still keep it within my brand. I have a lot of, family in my books, things that are, relationships are important. I wanted that to be key, which is why I chose my protagonist as a family. It wasn't just one person, but a father protecting his wife and kids. And I thought people would relate to that versus somebody, let's say, a
The stakes are much
ex-FBI
higher.
agent.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I wanted to keep it kind of adjacent to the kinds of stories that I like to tell, so that I wanted readers that were, my fantasy fans to give it a try, as well as people that were only maybe exclusively read thrillers to say, well, this cover looks interesting. Oh, I like the themes. I like the family. I like those things. I wanted this to be the kind of thing you'd watch on the Disney Plus or something, right?
Yeah.
That was kind of what the brand I was going for. And so it worked very well, but I definitely immersed of my brain in a lot of thrillers to be able to make sure I was understanding, the tropes and what the readers would expect, right? You don't want to just create something that's so different that like, this isn't what I was expecting it to be. I wouldn't want that kind of negative reaction. I'd want them to pull them in and then maybe entice them to come try some of my fantasy novels too. So that's one of the values, one of the positive outcomes of trying something else. Some of my reviews have said, this is my first Jeff Wheeler book. I'm going to give his fantasy a try now.
I love that. So, in terms of like, you had an idea, you were like, oh, I want to explore this more. But is this like a career shift for you? Are you going to be a thriller author now, or do you see yourself returning to fantasy? Like, what happens now that you've written these 3 books?
Good question. So my next series is definitely going back to fantasy again. Okay. Because, it's such a long runway of, from the time I started writing all these books to the end, I wanted to make sure I'm also also satisfying my core audience as well. I'm not going to preclude not, I haven't decided whether I'm going to write any more thrillers or not. Like, it's still too new to see, what that pacing looks like. But I did decide my new fantasy series was going to be something brand new as well. Because often I have several different worlds, and I've expanded those different worlds. And I wanted, from the very beginning of my career, Alessandra, I wanted to not be kind of pigeonholed into just one thing.
Yeah.
That sometimes a fantasy author has a world that's very popular, and then they end up going 20 books deep into it, but you lose fans. You only the most.
No one, you're not going to get a new fan at book 12, right? Yeah.
No,
right.
You won't. And so I found some success by always introducing new worlds. In fact, my website's like called The Worlds of Jeff Wheeler, because I didn't want to be stuck or pigeonholed into one. And so I wanted to have that creative freedom to be able to do some new things. And so I've got a new fantasy series that'll be coming out later this year, of course. But I haven't decided yet. It wasn't a pivot, like a permanent one, but I wanted to test it. Like, I wanted to see, can I do this? I wanted to have that creative growth. I learned a lot doing it. And then how can I bring that knowledge back to what I was doing with fantasy as well? And then decide, do I want to write more in the future as well? It's still too new to have made any long-term decisions with it yet, but I'm so glad that I did it because of how I've grown as an author.
I was going to say, I think just writing outside of our genres flexes different muscles. And we sometimes find pieces that we're like, oh, I want to implement this into my other writing, or this is a strength of mine or a weakness of mine that I discovered through this. And so I think I wrote romance for 6 or 7 years and then moved into suspense. I always wanted to be in suspense, but I found my romance always had suspense in it. And then I made the shift. And it is sort of it's creatively, I think we can get in a rut and we can find like a safe place, what is expected of us. And I like moving into new genres, but it can be a difficult business decision because you do have kind of where your money is. And then going into a new world can be risky.
No, it's true. And I can tell you understand how that works. But I think the value of having that creative freedom and not being constrained by, I have to keep writing in this world, I have to keep doing this, because I think that kind of atrophies your creative muscles a little bit too. And it makes the writing less vibrant. It makes it less interesting. And then I'm less excited. Like, to me, I have a little bit of fire in the belly, and I had a lot of fire in the belly to write Doomsday Match and it's the rest of the series. And you're so glad that I had that experience. And now I've got fire in the belly to go back to fantasy again. So I really have to make sure that passion is there before I even start the project to begin with.
So we have only 2 minutes left. So a few quick questions. Rob from YouTube. Hi, Rob said, did your thinking process change when going from world building versus researching real places?
Yeah, it certainly did. And it's funny because, some of the places I started researching the Yucatan before I'd gone down there. I'd been to Mexico before, but I'd never been to the Yucatan Peninsula, which is very different than places around, say, Mexico City or other places. So actually going down there, I was like, okay, I've got to rewrite some of these things because the just being in the climate, the physical things you could describe were so different. And so normally my world building approach for fantasy is, I might pick on, say, medieval England or medieval France, or even I've done a medieval China series. So that research there, all my research now about Mexico, about the Mayan, grabbing all these books, reading all these different things, definitely informed my process as I was doing it.
Did you already have first of all, did you visit there during the time frame, like summer or winter, that the book was written? And how much of the book had been written before you went there?
About half of it had been written. So I had the idea, and then had the idea of going down to Mexico for Christmas My family plus my brother's family, we went down there together to visit some of these places. And so we were down there exactly during the time that the book takes place, spending Christmas Day on the beach, eating ceviche with, mantas, swimming by your legs. That's very different than the winters I'm used to now. So absolutely. And it required a lot of, my imagination took me so far. But until I actually climbed a pyramid and saw how to climb them with the narrow steps and how tall they were, until I did that gave me such
felt the burn in your legs with all those stairs. Yeah.
No kidding, right? That just only added to the creative experience for sure.
We are out of time. Maybe we can just give a quick piece of advice to Peter. Peter is also on YouTube. And he has years and years of diaries in different areas like business, but also his training as a forester, his family's holidays and rotaries. Do you have any suggestion of how to change those diaries into different books?
I always keep track of my dreams, stories, things that do me, that kind of inspire me. But what inspires me the most are the characters, and that's even when I was writing Doomsday Match, it's like I wanted I based so many of the characters on attributes my family had.
Yeah.
And of course, as my kids have been reading it, they're like, Dad, it's like you're a little bit too revealing. All the things that inspire us in our life, we have to do, but we still have to distill the core from it. So I had, my time at Intel has influenced my writing. My time going on vacations has influenced my writing. Always keep an eye for those things. But what's the nugget? What's the thing that you can distill from that? Either the truth or the story that's going to be compelling for others. Because just because it's your life doesn't mean it's going to be interesting to other people too. So it's finding those nuggets, the things that, hey, when I tell this story over and over again, people's eyes light up. And I learned that as a high school student, right? I was a kind of a storyteller in high school, that certain stories got more interest. And when you're watching for that interest, that's how you know that it's resonating with somebody else. Just because it's interesting to you doesn't mean it's going to be interesting, to a large readership. So that's kind of the advice I would give.
That's fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Jeff. Happy New Year. It's been great to have you here. Thank you to everyone who joined us. This is a busy month for First Draft Friday. We will have another First Draft Friday in a week on Friday the 12th. I believe, and then another one the following Friday after that. So I hope you guys join us back, and best of luck with your upcoming release. So your next release date is in March, is that correct?
I think it's May. It's the third book of the Dresden Codex called Final Strike.
Final Strike, but they can read book 1 and book 2 now, and we did put those links in both Facebook and YouTube, so y'all can check those out. Thank you so much, Jeff. Thank you to everyone who joined us. We'll see you guys in a week.